Okay, so first I would like to thank the organizers for including my paper with Oscar in the program and for also giving me the opportunity to discuss this paper tonight. I had a great time reading it, and it's very related to the work that Oscar and I were doing on the paper, so it was really interesting for us also to read it while we were working on it. As usually people do in discussions, what I'm going to do is to split my discussion in two main points. First, I'll do a short summary of what Jordi just presented, basically because he had 35 minutes to sell it, so I don't have to sell it for him. So my comments, my discussion of what he did is going to be short. And then what I'll do is to go through the points that I want to make regarding his paper. And we'll see that what I'm going to try to do is actually to do something similar to what Luca did in his discussion of my paper, which is to map their work with the framework that Oscar and I had, and Oscar presented this morning. And this was not coordinated, but I thought it was interesting that we are doing kind of the same thing. Okay, so starting by looking at a little summary of what Jordi just presented, they are interested in estimating a wage Phillips curve, and as you know, the picture that Oscar showed this morning showed how important it is for us to identify shocks, to be able to estimate, in our case, a price Phillips curve, price inflation Phillips curve. And what Jordi Galli and Luca Gambetti are doing here is basically doing the same thing, but using a different framework. So their effort here is to try to identify shocks and use the framework to be able to disentangle or estimate the sensitivity of unemployment gap or measures of economic activity to the relationship between economic activity and wage inflation. Their main findings are that there is a decline in the slope coefficient, so the sensitivity of wage inflation to unemployment has declined. And they also find that there is a shrinking role for price inflation, past inflation. A short summary of what they do is, well, they are going to estimate VAR in which they rely on some identification assumptions and focus, well, they present a whole set of results in the paper looking at OLS and other types of identification, but one of the most interesting results, which Jordi got to the end of his presentation, is to look at the dynamic impulse response functions to specific shocks. And those dynamic multipliers are going to be giving you this relative sensitivity of inflation and unemployment to specific shocks. If we want to summarize their paper in one picture, I think going back to the picture that Jordi presented here a few minutes ago, this is showing the dynamic multiplier for a monetary shock. There are three key results here. First, the multiplier is always negative. The second one, we're seeing more persistent effects of unemployment than wage inflation. And I think one of the most interesting results here is the idea that the slope coefficient has declined over time. So if we look at the multiplier over time, it has been declining. And it seems like this decline has been gradual and not driven by the financial crisis per se. So it has been going on for some time. So turning to my comments, well, they're finding a declining sensitivity of wage inflation to unemployment. In the paper, they go through different measures of inflation, variations in the data, variations in the specification, and the results are pretty robust. Interestingly, this morning, Oscar presented our paper in which we were showing similar evidence in some ways, but using the price inflation Phillips curve. So one of the main results in Galli and Gambetti here is that the slope of the wage Phillips curve has declined. Oscar and I showed in our paper that the slope of the Phillips curve is much smaller than it used to be in the past. So the question that I want to try to answer in my last few minutes is, what would Oscar and I say about the wage Phillips curve? So Galli and Gambetti are approaching the data by looking at the US data. Oscar and I had a big panel of 45 countries or so. And so what I'm going to do next is try to expand their model, their results, and look at international evidence on the wage Phillips curve. So they have a set of results in the paper, and in my next few slides, I'm going to be focusing basically on this decline in the slope of the Phillips curve. So this is just a simple table summarizing what they found, and you find that from pre-crisis to post-crisis, there is a sharp decline in the slope of the wage Phillips curve, and you also see a decline in the past inflation coefficient. So this is just a way of me to summarize their results with a simple table. Now what I want to do is to go from the US evidence to the international evidence. That's a little bit of a challenge. So Oscar and I spent a lot of time cleaning the data and so on to build the panel of 45 countries that we had in that paper. I'm not going to be able to do that here. So what I'll do is to focus on OECD countries, which they're easier to obtain data, and the quality is usually, and the time sample is usually much better. I'm going to have to do some adjustments in the data that I'm going to use relative to what Jordi and Luca had. I'm going to be using labor compensation as a measure of wage inflation. It is not the ideal measure of wage inflation for these purposes, but that's what I could find for a set of countries in a consistent way. I'm going to be using CPI instead of GDP deflator. I want to map their findings to the framework that Oscar and I had, so I'm going to be using unemployment gap. I've tried using only unemployment, and everything holds through. And what I'm going to be doing is the same empirical framework that Oscar presented this morning. So the idea here is that if you want to look at this changes in coefficient over time, but it's possible that sets of countries had trends going on in the past. So we need to take into account those trends to try to answer the question whether changes in the coefficient were being driven by specific events or not. So the empirical framework that I'm going to be using here is basically the same that Oscar presented, except that I changed the equation a little bit to get closer to Galli and Gambetti's work. And what we're going to be able to do here is to look at whether the crisis is the one, the financial crisis was the one driving changes in coefficients. Okay, so given that I changed the data quite a lot relative to what they have, the first table here is just redoing that exercise from Galli's and Gambetti's table, and showing that their main findings still stand. So if you look at the top equation, it's just replicating the work by using different measures of economic activity and different measures of wage inflation, and you still find that you have a decline in the slope coefficient and also a decline in persistence. So what I do next is like, okay, check. If I change a little bit their data and I change a little bit the equation, I still get the same type of results that they have. So let's see what happens when I look at the OECD data, when I look at international evidence. And this is the bottom table. And then I'm looking at the results, and I'm like, well, great. Persistence, the lag inflation coefficient declined, as in Galli and Gambetti. But weirdly, the coefficient on slack, on the unemployment gap, became stronger. So the sensitivity seems to have increased. And so then what I do is to turn to the big table that Oscar didn't want to talk about, and now he makes my life a little bit harder. But here now what we're going to do is to try to see what we get out of the diff and diff framework. So what I'm doing here is getting my set of OECD countries, splitting them between countries that went through the financial crisis, countries that didn't go through the financial crisis, and looking at the estimation of the slope coefficient and the persistence coefficient. And very interestingly, and in line with the results from Galli and Gambetti, when we look at the countries that have been through the crisis, the bottom red circle, we see a decline in the slope coefficient. But when we focus on countries that did not go through the financial crisis, there is an increase in the absolute value of the coefficient. So the results that I showed you in the previous slide were based the increasing in the absolute value that I showed you in the previous slide were coming from were basically being driven by the set of countries that are in the no crisis set. This, I think, it's a useful chart that Oscar showed this morning, and basically show you that what's happening before the crisis and after the crisis with the coefficients that I just presented on that table. And here we see the increase in the sensitivity of no crisis countries. So this is basically a picture of the table that we just looked before. But we see a decline in the sensitivity for countries that have been through the financial crisis. And the diff and diff effect is the red bar, and which is telling us that the crisis seems to have had a big impact in the set of countries in the sample. I want to skip some of my slides and go to the last two ones and then come back. But it's interesting, I think, to take a little bit of a look on the data set that is driving these results. And so what I have here is the data that is feeding these regressions for wage inflation. And the next slide is going to show you the unemployment gap data. And I mean, before the, if we're labeling the financial, we started the financial crisis in 2008 Q1, but you can see that the wage inflation was kind of close to each other for no crisis and crisis countries. Again, this is only using OECD data. And the financial crisis had some impact on wage inflation for both types of countries, but the recovery of wage inflation for no crisis countries seemed to be happen much quicker. And you see a wedge between the two rolling averages here. In terms of unemployment gap, the picture, I think, is even more interesting. We see before the crisis a boom in both no crisis countries and crisis countries, but the effects of the crisis on the unemployment gap in crisis countries is much more persistent, right? So, I mean, this is basically giving you a glimpse of a short summary of the data that feeds into the regressions that I was showing you before. So, I wanted to go to my last slide and try to summarize what these two papers are finding. So I think both of us, I mean, Galli and Gambetti are taking a different empirical approach than Oscar and I, and they are focusing on wage Phillips curve while we are focusing on the price inflation Phillips curve. Both of us are finding a flat Phillips curve, right? So the sensitivity of wage inflation and price inflation to measures of economic activity seem to be smaller than they were in the past. So Galli and Gambetti showed this for US evidence. Oscar and I use Price-Phillips curve and international evidence to show and find the same findings. In this discussion, what I did was to show that the international evidence also points to a flat wage Phillips curve, but it shows that there is a very strong correlation between this flattening and the episode of the financial crisis. So after all this, what I think is missing in terms of mapping the results of the two papers is to pointing or pinning down exactly the timing of the decline, when this decline started to happen, and whether if it was driven by the crisis or not. Some results are pointing in one direction, some results are pointing in some other. I think we have a consensus of a flatter Phillips curve, but I think it's still a question for further research to study more the timing and what is behind the decline in the sensitivity. Thank you.